I took the bullet for the Mafia boss's mother. She told his son, kneel before her. The bullet hit me before I understood I had moved. 1 second I was standing beside a 78-year-old Jewish woman named Miriam Kesler inside a small stone chapel in Philadelphia. The next second, glass fell like rain, and my shoulder felt as if someone had driven a burning nail through it and out the other side. I did not scream. I only thought, don't let her fall. My name is Hannah Mercer. I am 30 years old, and I am a nurse. I had been Miriam's private caregiver for 41 days, and when I woke up in the hospital, her son, Jonah Kesler, the most feared Mafia boss in the city, was standing at the foot of my bed with tears in his eyes. Then his own mother looked at him and said, in a voice as dry and steady as an old page turning, kneel before her. And the man half of Philadelphia was afraid of, in front of every soldier in his house, did. Before I tell you how a nurse ended up bleeding on the marble floor of a Mafia chapel, you need to understand one thing about Jonah Kesler. Everything I thought I knew about him was wrong, and everything I was about to learn would cost me more than a bullet. If this opening pulled you in, do me one small favor. Tap that like button and subscribe, because this is not the story you think it is, and the part that will break your heart hasn't happened yet. 41 days earlier, I stood at the iron gate of the Kesler estate with a small suitcase in one hand and my mother's old leather Bible in the other. The agency had warned me only that the client was elderly, Jewish, recovering from a fall, and lived with her son. They had not told me the son's name. They had not told me the house had 4 armed men at the gate and dogs the size of small ponies inside. When the driver said Kesler, my stomach dropped, because everyone in Philadelphia knew that name, and no one said it out loud in a good way. I almost turned around. I am a Protestant Christian. I sing in the choir at Bethel Grace on Sundays. My father Daniel is 64 and walks with a cane after 20 years of climbing utility poles. My mother Rebecca is 62 and cries during hymns. They raised me to believe that money earned from other people's misery cannot be washed clean by a nice paycheck. And yet my father needed a specialist my insurance would not cover. And the Kesler agency was offering 3 months' salary for 6 weeks of work. I told God I was sorry, and I walked through the gate. Miriam Kesler was sitting in a sunroom the size of my parents' entire house, wrapped in a shawl the color of oatmeal, reading a book so worn the spine had been rebound with cloth tape. She looked up when I came in, and her eyes were the kind of blue that could cut glass. "You're the church girl," she said, not unkindly. "The last 3 quit inside a week. 2 of them stole from me. 1 of them tried to save my soul." She closed the book with a soft snap. "Which one are you?" I told her I was neither. I told her I would not work on Sunday mornings unless she was in genuine medical distress, that I would pray before I ate and before I slept, and that I would not lie to her about anything, including her prognosis. She stared at me for a long moment. Then she smiled, and the whole room seemed to warm by 10 degrees. "Finally," she said, "someone with a spine. Sit down, church girl. Tell me about your mother. A woman who raised a daughter with a spine is a woman I want to know." I met her son that same evening. Jonah Kesler was 52, tall, gray at the temples, dressed like a banker and standing like a soldier. He did not offer his hand. He watched me for exactly the amount of time it took a grandfather clock in the hallway to strike 7. Then he said, "My mother told you her rules. I will tell you mine. You do not lie to her. You do not lie to me. If she asks for something I have forbidden, you tell me. If I ask for something she has forbidden, you tell her." He paused. "And Miss Mercer, on Sunday mornings this house will be quiet for you." I did not know what to do with that. I had expected mockery. I had expected a bribe. Instead, a man rumored to have buried 3 rivals in a single winter had just arranged his household around my worship schedule. That night, in a guest room bigger than my apartment, I wrote in my journal, "He is not what they say." Then I crossed it out and wrote, "He is exactly what they say, and something else too." I did not sleep. I sat by the window watching the guards change shifts on the lawn below, and I asked God the question I have asked him 100 times since. What am I supposed to do with a man who is 2 men? My mother had told me once, in the kitchen drying a plate, that most people are one person and a shadow, and the trouble in a life comes when you cannot tell which one is which. Sitting there by that window, with a Bible on my knees and a gun tower on the lawn, I thought maybe she had been talking about a man like this one all along, and had simply not known his name. The first crack in my judgment came on day 4. I was walking the back hallway when I heard Jonah's voice through a half-open door, low and cold, telling someone on the phone. He knew the rules. He broke them. I am not interested in his family's excuses. Handle it. I froze. My mouth went dry. I had just heard a death sentence. Then the call ended, the door opened, and Jonah stepped out carrying a chipped ceramic bowl of shredded chicken. He walked past me without a word, and knelt on the kitchen floor beside an enormous brown dog with milky eyes and a limp so bad she could barely stand. Her name was Ruthie. She was 14. Nobody had wanted her. Jonah fed her by hand, piece by piece, whispering something I could not hear. When she finished, he pressed his forehead to hers and stayed there for a full minute. I stood in the hallway with a stack of clean towels in my arms, and I did not know which man to believe. Later I learned that the phone call had not been about killing anyone. It had been about a bookkeeper who had been stealing from a widow's pension fund, and handle it meant refund the widow and put the bookkeeper on a bus out of town without his shoes. I did not learn that until much later. On day 4, all I knew was that the same hands that had ordered a man's ruin were now trembling against a dying dog's ears. That was only the beginning. Within 2 weeks, I had counted the contradictions the way I once counted verses. Jonah remembered that my mother took her tea with 2 spoons of honey, not sugar. He never once asked about it, but a jar of raw honey appeared in the kitchen for the days she visited. He arranged a specialist for my father through a hospital I had never been able to get past the front desk of, and when I tried to thank him, he looked genuinely confused, as if kindness were an accounting error he had forgotten to correct. He hired a carpenter to widen the doorframe at my parents' house so my father's walker would fit, and he did it while my parents were at church so no one could refuse. He had 3 rescue dogs: Ruthie, the blind mastiff, Max, the arthritic shepherd, and Solomon, a small ragged terrier with 3 legs and a permanent tremble. All 3 slept in his study. All 3 ate before he did, and every Friday at sundown he lit 2 candles for his mother and stood silently while she said a prayer in Hebrew he did not interrupt, and then he closed the door softly so I could kneel and say mine. I want you to hold on to that image, because it is the one that will hurt the most later. The envelopes began in my 3rd week. Miriam called me into the sunroom one morning and handed me 4 sealed, cream-colored envelopes, each addressed by hand. "Deliver these yourself," she said. "One to St. Anne's on Fitzwater, one to Beth Shalom on 16th, one to the Wesley Senior Center in Kensington, one to the Little Baptist Mission on Diamond Street." She pressed my hand. "Jonah is not to know which envelope went to which address. Do you understand me, child?" I nodded because I did not understand at all. I delivered them the next morning. At St. Anne's, an old priest opened his envelope, read one line, and made the sign of the cross with tears in his eyes. At Beth Shalom, a rabbi read his and sat down as if his legs had failed him. At the Wesley Center, a director in a cardigan read hers and whispered, "Thank God, thank God." At the Baptist Mission on Diamond Street, an elderly black woman named Pastor Lorraine read her page, looked up at me and said, "You tell that man his mother raised a mensch." I did not know what a mensch was. I looked it up in the car. It means a person of integrity and honor. I sat in that car for a long time, holding my steering wheel with both hands, watching a pigeon on the hood of the car in front of me, wondering what kind of a man makes 4 different faith communities cry with a single sentence and refuses to sign his own name at the bottom of any of them. 2 days later, I found a stranger in Miriam's bedroom. He was one of the household staff, a quiet man named Emile, who had worked in the kitchen for 6 years. He was standing at Miriam's nightstand, and in his hands was her prayer book, the little battered one with the cloth-taped spine that she carried everywhere. He was not stealing it. He was photographing the pages with his phone. He saw me, and his face went the color of paper. "Miss Mercer," he said, "please." I did not answer. I walked out, closed the door, and went straight to Jonah's study. I did not tell him what I had seen. I told him only that Emil had been in Miriam's room without permission. Within an hour, Emil was gone from the house. Within 2 days, I learned he had left the country. Jonah asked me exactly one question about it that evening, quietly. Did he take anything? I told him no, that the prayer book was still on the nightstand. Something in his face changed, just for a second, and then it was gone. Thank you, Hannah, he said. It was the first time he had called me by my first name, and I felt something turn in my chest that I refused, for the next 3 weeks, to name. If you're still with me, if this story is pulling you in, please tap the like button now. It genuinely helps stories like this reach the people who need them, and I promise you, the reason a mafia boss's mother would command her son to kneel before a nurse is not what you're guessing right now. The businesses began closing in my 4th week. I overheard it by accident, a hard conversation between Jonah and a man named Martin Voss in the library, the doors not quite shut. Martin was 57, silver-haired, always in a charcoal suit, and had been what Miriam privately called Jonah's right hand for 23 winters. I had liked Martin from the first day. He remembered my father's name. He asked about my mother's garden. He brought Miriam pears from a farm upstate. That afternoon his voice was not warm. You are bleeding this family, Jonah, he said. 2 warehouses last month, the pier operation this week, the card room on Pattison. That is $14 million a year you have simply set on fire. For what? Jonah's voice was quieter than Martin's, and somehow it filled the room more completely. For sleep, Martin. I want to sleep at night. Martin laughed, but there was no humor in it. Sleep is for men who have already lost. When your father built this house, he did not sleep. He watched. There was a long silence. Then Jonah said, My father is dead, Martin. So are most of the men who watched with him. I am the one who has to decide what we leave behind, and I have already decided. I stepped away from the door before I could hear Martin's answer, but I saw his face when he left the study half an hour later, and it was not the face of a man who had accepted anything. It was the face of a man who had begun, right there in that hallway, to plan something. The next Sunday, on my way home from church, 3 elderly strangers stopped me in 3 different places. A widow at the bus stop pressed a warm loaf of bread into my hands and said, Tell Mr. Kesler my grandson finished trade school. He said to tell him. A retired dock worker at the diner refused to let me pay for my coffee and said, You work for the good one, don't you? You tell him Frank Bellini said thank you for the pension. Tell him my knees still hurt, but they hurt in a warm apartment now, and that is a difference a man does not forget. An old woman outside my parents' church touched my sleeve and said only, He gave me back my son. Tell him. I did not ask what she meant. I did not tell Jonah any of it. Not yet. I did not know what I would be telling. I only knew that whatever this man was, he had left a trail of quiet gratitude across the poorest streets in this city, and none of it was under his own name. The interfaith memorial was Miriam's idea. She had lost an old friend, a woman named Sarah who had been both her hairdresser and her confidant for 40 years, and she wanted a small service that honored both Sarah's Jewish faith and her late husband's Baptist one. It was to be held on a Tuesday morning at a tiny stone chapel behind a hospice, with a rabbi, a pastor, and no more than 20 guests. Jonah did not want her to go. He said the location was too open, the windows too high, the sightlines too long. Miriam looked at him over her reading glasses and said, Jonah, I have buried more people than you have threatened. I am going. He sent 4 men with us anyway. Martin Voss personally chose the security route. I want you to remember that sentence. The chapel smelled like beeswax and old hymnals. I sat 1 row behind Miriam because she liked to know I was close, but did not want me to feel like an employee at a private moment. The rabbi lit a candle. The pastor read a psalm. Miriam closed her eyes and mouthed along with both, first in Hebrew, then in English, moving between the 2 languages the way a woman moves between the rooms of her own home. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen inside a room that small. Miriam reached back for my hand without turning her head, the way she did every night before she took her sleeping pill, and I gave it to her. Her fingers were warm and dry and a little papery, And I remember thinking, this is what a life feels like at 78. This is what I am here to keep alive for 6 more weeks. Then the light on the back wall snapped, and the window above the pastor's shoulder exploded inward, and I was already moving before my brain caught up. I hit Miriam sideways, wrapped my arms around her the way I would wrap a child, and pulled her down between the pews. Something white-hot punched through my left shoulder and out my back. I heard a second shot chip stone above us. I heard men shouting. I heard Miriam whispering, in Hebrew, then in English, "Not this one, God, not this one, please, not this one." I realized, in a distant, drifting way, that she was praying for me. Not for herself, for me. I woke up in a hospital room in the small hours of the morning. My shoulder was bandaged so heavily I could not lift my arm. Miriam was in the chair beside my bed, holding my right hand in both of hers, still in the black dress she had worn to the service, dried blood on the collar that was not hers. Jonah was standing at the foot of the bed. He had not sat down. I do not think he had blinked. When my eyes focused on him, his mouth moved once before any sound came out. "You will not do that again," he said. His voice was almost steady. "Do you hear me, Hannah? You will never do that again." I tried to say something clever. What came out was, "She was praying for me." Jonah closed his eyes. Miriam squeezed my hand. Somewhere down the hall a machine beeped, and I realized, watching Jonah's face, that the man in this room was not the man who had knelt in his kitchen to feed a blind dog. This was the other one. The one people whispered about. The one who had come back. He left within the hour. Miriam told me quietly, "He is going to the old man, the one inside him. God help whoever fired that gun." I did not sleep that night either, but not because of the pain. The next morning I forced myself to sit up, and I asked Miriam to tell me everything she remembered about the chapel. Not the shot, the seconds before it and the seconds after. She closed her eyes and walked me through it, and as she spoke, something in me went very still. Because I had been shielding her body with mine for at least 4 seconds before the second shot came, and that second shot had gone into stone above our heads, not into her, not into me, into stone. A shooter who could put one bullet through a window from a rooftop across a courtyard could put a second one wherever he wanted. He had chosen not to. "Miriam," I said slowly, "he wasn't trying to kill you." She opened her eyes. Those glass-cutting blue eyes went straight into mine. "No, child," she said. "He was trying to kill my son, just not with a bullet." She squeezed my hand until it hurt. "He was trying to kill the man my son has been trying to become." Here is where I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments before you hear the rest. If you were me, still bleeding through your bandages, and you knew that telling Jonah Kesler the truth would stop him from starting a war, but you also knew that lying to him might save your own life, what would you do? Because that was the choice I had, and I had about 6 hours to make it. I chose the truth. I called Jonah's driver, a young man named Reuben who had been kind to me from the first day, and I told him I needed to see Jonah before he did anything he could not undo. Reuben looked at me for a long moment, then nodded once and made a call. Jonah came to the hospital himself at 4 in the afternoon. He was wearing a different suit. His hands smelled faintly of gun oil. I told him what I had realized. He listened without moving. When I finished, he said, "You are guessing, Hannah." I said, "I am a nurse, Jonah. I know the difference between a shot meant to kill and a shot meant to make you look." He had 4 seconds. He used them to miss. Jonah sat down very slowly in the chair by the window. For the first time since I had met him, he looked his age. "If you are right," he said, "then somebody in my own house wanted me to walk into a war." I did not answer, because we both already knew who chose the security route. He put his hands over his face for a long moment. Then he stood up, kissed my forehead once, very lightly, without asking permission, and walked out of the room to call off men I did not want to imagine. Miriam asked me to bring her the prayer book that evening. When I set it on her lap, she opened it not to the printed prayers but to the blank pages in the back. They were not blank. They were covered in dates, written in a firm, slanted hand, going back 11 years. Beside each date, in tiny letters, was a word or two. Warehouse Fulton, Cardroom Pattison, Pier 6, Trust Beth Shalom, Trust St. Anne's, Pension, Bellini, Pension, Delgado, Widow Cohen, Apartment, Ruthie, Adoption. Page after page. 11 years. I looked up at her. She was watching me with an expression I could not name. "My son," she said softly, "has been closing his father's kingdom one nail at a time since the winter his father died. Every closed business, every quiet pension, every envelope you delivered, every dog in that study. They are all in this book, in my handwriting, because if it were in his hand and someone found it, he would already be dead." She closed the book gently. "Someone has been looking for this book, Hannah, because if they can prove what he is doing before he finishes it, they can stop him. Or worse, they can use it to make him stop himself." I thought of Emile with his phone above her nightstand. I thought of Martin Voss choosing the chapel route. And I understood. I understood the envelopes, and the gratitude on the streets, and why a man who ordered a bookkeeper out of the country would kneel beside a dying dog. He had not been two men. He had been one man, patiently building an exit out of a house that did not allow doors. The confrontation happened 3 nights later, in the library of the Kesler estate, with rain against the tall windows, and every important man in the organization sitting in a half-circle of leather chairs. I was not supposed to be there. Miriam insisted. She had me in a wheelchair beside her, my arm in a sling, and she held my good hand under the blanket across her lap the entire time. Jonah stood in front of the fireplace. Martin sat on his left, calm, unreadable, a glass of water on the small table beside him. Jonah laid out the evidence quietly. The rooftop, the angles, the 4 seconds, the security route Martin had personally selected, the manufactured Moretti fingerprints on a shell casing that had been planted, not fired, the photographs Emile had sent from a number that traced through 3 shell accounts back to Martin's private line. When Jonah finished, Martin did not deny any of it. He simply looked at Jonah with something that was almost affection, and he said, "I did it because you are killing us, Jonah, slowly, deliberately, for 11 years. I gave your father 23 years of my life. I did not do it so his son could turn our house into a charity for old women and blind dogs." A murmur ran through the room. Martin stood up. "I needed you angry, Jonah. I needed you back. One good war and you would remember who you are. The men in this room would remember who they are, and this ridiculous 11-year suicide would end." He spread his hands. "So yes, I hired the shooter. I told him to miss. I told him to make you think it was the Morettis, because I am not going to inherit ashes." Then Martin moved. It was very fast. He had a small pistol under the water glass. He crossed the room in 3 steps and put his arm around Miriam's throat and the pistol under her jaw before anyone could stand. "You will call off every closure by tomorrow morning," he said to Jonah, "or she dies in this chair." The room went absolutely still. Jonah's face went the color of old iron, and I felt Miriam's fingers under the blanket deliberately go loose, and then tight, and then loose again in a slow rhythm. She had done it every morning for 41 days when I helped her with her exercises. She was telling me she was ready. I said, out loud, in the calmest voice I could find, "Martin, she can't breathe. She has a heart condition. If she goes limp, you have nothing." I looked at Miriam. She let her head roll sideways and her eyes flutter, exactly the way I had taught her to demonstrate distress for a doctor. Martin instinctively loosened his arm to check her. In that half-second, Jonah's security chief, a man named David Aronson, who had loved Miriam since he was a boy in her kitchen, put a bullet through Martin's wrist. The pistol fell. Miriam slid out of his grip into my lap, and I held her there with my one good arm, while men I had feared for 41 days pulled Martin to the floor. Jonah did not kill him. He stood over Martin for a long moment. Every man in that room expected the end of the story to happen right there. I saw one of them, an old capo with a scar down his cheek, actually turn his face away, out of respect for what he thought was about to happen. Instead, Jonah said, You wanted me to be my father. I am not going to be my father. You are going to be handed to the federal prosecutor with enough evidence on contract killings and interstate trafficking to bury you in a cell until you die of old age. And every man in this room is going to watch me do it, so you will all know exactly what kind of house this is now." He turned to face the half-circle of leather chairs. "The house is closing, all of it. If you want out with a legitimate pension, my mother will help you find one. If you want to fight me for what is left, understand there is nothing left to fight for. I have spent 11 years making sure of that." Nobody moved. Then Miriam, still in my lap, still with her hand in mine, lifted her head and spoke in a voice that was suddenly not frail at all. "Jonah, before any of these men leaves this room, there is one more thing." Jonah turned. She looked at him steadily. "This woman put her body between me and a bullet. She saw what none of us saw. She stopped you from becoming what Martin wanted you to become. She saved my life and she saved your soul." Miriam paused. Every man in the room was watching. "You will not pay her. You will not give her money. Money would make her a servant. She is not a servant." She lifted her chin. "Kneel before her, Jonah, in this room, in front of these men, as my son and as the head of this house. Kneel." For one long second I thought he might refuse. Then Jonah Kesler, the most feared man in Philadelphia, walked across a Persian rug in a room full of men who had spent their entire adult lives fearing him, and he lowered himself to one knee in front of my wheelchair. He took my good hand. He bowed his head. He said, quietly enough that only I heard it, "Thank you for my mother, and thank you for me." I did not cry. I do not know why. I only put my hand on the top of his head, the way my mother used to bless me when I was small, and I whispered, "God be with you, Jonah." When he stood up, no man in that room ever looked at him the same way again, and no man ever looked at me like a servant again either. The old capo with the scar simply stood up from his chair, walked to me, and inclined his head half an inch, the way a man does when he does not have words for what he has just seen. He asked me the next morning, in the sunroom, if I would stay. Not as a nurse, as his life. He offered me everything a woman is supposed to want. A house, safety, the chance to build something with him from the ruins he was still tearing down. He said it plainly, without eloquence, the way a man says the most important sentence of his life. I sat with the sun on my hands for a long time. Then I told him the truth. I told him that I loved him. I told him that I would love him for the rest of my life. And I told him I could not marry him. I told him my faith was not a coat I put on for Sundays. I told him I would not ask him to become a Christian to keep me, and I would not become someone I was not to keep him. I told him that a home built on either of us breaking would not hold. He listened. He did not argue. He did not offer compromises. He did not promise to build me a chapel on the property, or convert quietly, or attend Bethel Grace on Sundays as a gesture. Any of those things would have been easier for me to refuse than what he actually said. When I finished, he looked at me for a long moment, and I saw him choose, in real time, to love me more than he wanted me. Then he said, "If you agreed to stay by breaking that, you would not be the woman I love. And I am not going to trade the woman I love for a woman who looks like her." Then he stood up, kissed the top of my head the way I had touched his the night before, and he walked out of the sunroom without looking back. Because I think if he had looked back, he would not have been able to leave. Miriam found me a few minutes later. She sat down beside me on the sunroom bench. She did not say a word. She only took my hand and held it, and after a while she pressed her old, worn prayer book into my palm and closed my fingers around it and said, "You keep this now, church girl. It has done its work in this house." I went home to my parents. My father asked no questions. My mother took one look at me, put her arms around me, and let me cry for an hour without saying a word. That night my father, who had barely spoken about Jonah the entire 6 weeks I had been at the Kesler estate, sat down beside my bed in his old flannel robe and said only, "You did right by God, girl. That is the only right there is." Then he squeezed my hand with his shaking one and went to bed. Over the next 8 months, I heard about him only through the news and through Miriam's occasional letters. Warehouses closed. Card rooms shuttered. A charity took over a pier. 3 more elderly widows received small pensions from a source they could not name. Martin Voss was sentenced to 41 years. The Kesler organization, as a criminal thing, quietly ceased to exist. In its place, on the ground floor of what had once been the estate's east wing, opened the Miriam Kesler Center, a small home for elderly people who could not afford care and for old dogs and cats nobody else would take. It ran in partnership with 3 churches, 2 synagogues, and a Baptist mission on Diamond Street. Pastor Lorraine sat on its board. So did the rabbi from Beth Shalom. So did my father, once he could walk without a cane. Miriam wrote me every 2 weeks, short letters, in the same firm, slanted hand as the prayer book. She never once asked me to come back. She only told me what was blooming in the garden, and which dogs had been adopted, and which old men had died with someone holding their hand. Every letter ended the same way. Your room is here when you decide, church girl. Only when you decide. I went back on a Sunday afternoon in early spring. Not to move in, not to marry him, just to see. Jonah was in the yard with Solomon, the 3-legged terrier, brushing him slowly on a folded blanket. He looked up. He did not stand up right away. He just watched me walk across the grass. When I reached him, he said, "You came." I said, "I came." He said, "For how long?" I said, "For today, and we will see about tomorrow." He nodded, the way a man nods when he has learned to want less and receive more. Then he moved over on the blanket, and I sat down beside him, and we brushed an old dog together while the light went gold across the grass. Ruthie had died the month before, Miriam wrote me later. She had died in Jonah's study, on her own bed, with his hand on her ribs. He had wept for 2 days. I did not know any of that yet, sitting on that blanket. I only knew that Solomon's fur was warm under my palm, and that the man beside me was breathing more slowly than any man I had ever known, and that this, whatever this was allowed to be small. We are not married. We may never be. We pray in different rooms. We keep different holy days. But every morning I walk into that center, and I help old women button their sweaters, and I hold the hands of old men who are afraid to die, and Jonah walks the dogs, and at noon we sit on a bench under a maple tree and we eat lunch together, and he tells me about his day, and I tell him about mine, and neither of us asks the other to be anything except exactly who we are. On Sunday mornings he drives me to Bethel Grace and waits in the parking lot with a book, and on Friday evenings I sit outside the door of Miriam's room while she says the prayer over the candles, and when she is finished, she opens the door and calls me church girl and asks me to sit with her for tea. That is the shape our life has taken. It is not the shape either of us imagined. It is the shape we were given, and we have decided to be grateful for it. If you have listened this far, thank you. Truly. Stories like this only find the people who need them when you tap that like button and leave a comment. So before you go, tell me one thing. If it had been you kneeling in that library, would you have accepted his offer, or would you have walked home to your parents like I did? There is no wrong answer. There is only the answer your own conscience gives you at 3 in the morning. Tell me yours. I will read every one. Because the man everyone in Philadelphia once feared did not become good the day he met me. He had already been becoming good, quietly, for 11 years, one closed door at a time. I only arrived in time to stop someone from dragging him backward. And the greatest thing he ever did for me was not kneeling in that library. It was letting me walk out the door the next morning, and waiting, without asking, without pulling, without pretending to be something he was not, until I chose to walk back through it on my own. That is the story of how I took a bullet for a Mafia boss's mother, and how she made her feared son kneel before a nurse. That is the story of how the same nurse walked away from him with his mother's prayer book in her hands. And that is the story of how, in the end, both of us finally came home, in different rooms, under the same roof, with an old dog on a blanket between us, and a God on either side who was patient enough to wait for both of us at once.